Back here in the U.S., Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke spoke to community bankers earlier today, reassuring them that the new financial regulations are aimed primarily at big banks, which were key players in the financial crisis. We'll talk about this and more now with Gary Stern, who was the president of the Minneapolis Fed from 1985 to 2009. He's also the co-author of the book, Too Big to Fail, The Hazards of Bank Bailouts. Gary, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Let me ask you first about what's been sort of the running topic on this show and obviously in Fed world as well, which is QE2. For a long time, the question was, do they even bother to finish QE2? And now more and more we're hearing people use the phrase QE3.
Well, before we get to QE3, let me say that I found the focus on QE2 a bit fascinating because it seemed to me to be much ado about little. And what I mean by that is, let's suppose the program is successful, by which I mean longer-term interest rates are somewhat lower than they otherwise would be. That would have a positive but not a profound effect on economic performance and employment growth in this economy. So even taken at its best, it seems to me that the expectations would be for a small impact from QE2. QE3, my own view is it's unlikely, but certainly not beyond the realm of possibility. I think the key thing to watch is employment. I think key policymakers at the Fed, I'm not talking about the entire committee, but I think key policymakers at the Fed are concerned principally about employment. Do we get sustained significant gains in employment? And are there forecasts of further sustained significant gains in employment? If there are, all to the good, no need for QE3. But without that, then you have to consider what the policy stance might be.
I want to ask you about the impact of housing. And first, let me just play, we talked to Barton Biggs yesterday, and he talked about QE3, and he said it's very crucial, the housing component. First, let's listen up to this.
Prices keep falling. I think there's a fairly good probability that he's not going to end QE2, and there may be a QE3.
What about the impact of housing? We got some bad housing data again today. That's not as important. I understand you said the labor market much more important. Well, what about housing as a factor in QE3?
Well, in my view and in my experience at the Fed, housing doesn't play the same role in Fed policy deliberations. Certainly it would be better if housing were improving. But we have to be realistic. We knew we had a big inventory overhang problem in housing. Lots of unsold, unoccupied homes and condominiums. It's going to take time to work our way through that. How much time is difficult to say, but we shouldn't be surprised that housing has continued to struggle.
Although aren't home prices one of the main things the Fed looks at? I mean, when you're talking about inflation, they seem to ignore everything but housing and iPads, right? I mean, everything else is soaring in price, and these are the two things that are making people so worried about deflation.
Well, I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, core inflation is positive but very modest, and that includes more than housing and iPad prices. And obviously we're in a world where some prices are rising rapidly, some commodities, food, energy, et cetera, some prices are not, and in some cases declining. I don't think the Fed necessarily has it wrong on the inflation side at the moment, although there are obviously lots of issues and concerns there. I think with regard to housing, I would emphasize the inventory situation and the fact that it's simply going to take time to work our way through that. Exactly how much, I don't pretend to know, but I do think that until we make progress in reducing unsold, unoccupied homes, we should expect low levels of activity and declining prices.
We're going to continue to see data like this, like what we saw this morning.
Maybe not as bad as today's, but certainly nothing to write home about.
All right, so just be patient. When are we going to start having to write home about inflation? How quickly could it turn in your view?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of inertia in inflation, and so I don't think it will turn that quickly, although obviously there's a lot of concern today, especially with what you're seeing in food and energy globally. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we have to be, I think a little bit of analysis helps there. After all, there was a drought in Russia and in Australia, and that's had an impact on food prices. There's rapid growth in India and China, and that affects demand for food and for energy, and those are relatively energy inefficient economies, by which I mean takes a lot of energy to produce a unit of output relative to the industrial world.
So it's not all just low interest rates. Ben Bernanke shouldn't feel responsible
and
for
not
all
only
this.
that, I don't think there is it's hard to think of a policy that the Fed or any other central bank could implement that would have a particular effect on food and energy prices. I mean, after all, Milton Friedman said, and he was right, that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. It's not too much money chasing food and energy. And
hang on.
I can't imagine that you disagree with Fisher that much.
Well, I think Richard is clearly right that financial conditions in this country are not restraining the pace of the expansion. So I agree with him on that. As far as a lot of speculative activity, I know the things he cited, but, you know, it wasn't very many months ago that we were talking about the reluctance of lenders to meet the needs of qualified borrowers and so on and so forth. So, you know, I wonder if the
that reluctance may still be there, right? I mean, this just goes back to what we were talking about before the break, that Ben Bernanke is in some senses driving up commodities prices around the world.
As I said, I'm not sure I attribute the rise in commodity prices to monetary policy, and certainly not just to Federal Reserve policy. There are, after all, other central banks in the world. But to get back to speculation and financial conditions, you know, my suspicion is that we're somewhere in the middle here, where conditions have become more accommodative, but I don't think we're at the point of speculative excess. I do think the Fed faces a challenge, and it's a challenge they always face, and that is, when do you start to move away from accommodation? When do you begin to tighten?
So when do they, and when do we start to see higher rates? Because we've just got a few seconds here.
Okay. You know, that's a good guess. My judgment would be the earliest would be late this year, more likely sometime in the spring or summer of next year. And I premise that on the comments I made earlier about the labor market.
All right, so it could be another year before we see higher rates.
It could be.
Wow.
From the Fed.
Got it. Gary, thank you so much.
Okay.
Gary Stern joining us here on Street Smart.
Thank you
Good to
very
have
much.
you here.